Hi everyone, today we're joined by Greg Rehmke of economicthinking.org, and he's here to talk to us about one of the LD topics at Stoa this year, about how developing countries should prioritize economic development over environmental protection. Greg, what are the initial thoughts that come to your mind when you hear this topic?
Well, it's a fascinating topic. I think the key sort of uh, story for students to understand on the topic is what's called and I might pronounce it wrong, the environmental Acoustics Curve. Basically, the story is, as any country develops, when average annual income is under about $6,000, maybe $8,000 now with inflation, there's going to be significant environmental degradation. That is more pollution, more junk, more problems. But once a country gets over $6,000 to $8,000 a year in average annual income, the environment starts to improve. And this is an empirical study from around the world. There's been many studies that support this, and you can understand why. If you're a family in Mexico and you're making $6,000 a year, you're dealing with shelter, food, clothing, and you're barely getting by. And whether there's more pollution in the sky or junk on the side of the road, that's not a major concern of yours. You don't like it, but you've got more important issues. As the country gets wealthier, the environment tends to improve and improve significantly. So stories of that, Taiwan in the 50s and 60s was incredibly polluted and awful. Then they got rich, and they were able to spend billions of dollars in sewage treatment plants, cleaning up pollution, cleaner factories, and now the country is wealthy and clean. The United States, even in the 60s and 70s, Puget Sound near me, you couldn't swim in it. It was called Lake Stinky, I think. It was full of sewage. But then as Seattle got wealthier, they spent billions of dollars with sewage treatment plants, decreasing pollution. So all around the U.S., cities' waters are much cleaner than they used to be in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. That same process is happening in the developing world. The parts of China that are developed, that were freed earlier in the south and on the coast, are much cleaner than the polluted places inside. So that's just an economic story of development and decreasing pollution go hand in hand above a certain level. At the beginning, they don't.
Well, tell me this. In that observation, is it a regulation-driven improvement that after this certain point, or does it just happen kind of organically that people start to care about these things more? What is the mechanism for improving the environment in these cases?
Well, we find that it happens on its own around the world. So we see it happening, and it's sort of common sense in that when people have more money, they're willing to delegate more money on environmental benefits. So you find all the major environmentalists in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the U.S. I mean, they were wealthy people. You know, the Rockefellers and others. They spent money on environmental benefits, partly because they had money to spend on that. So in China, I think Jack Ma, the head of Alibaba, just bought $100 million of property in New York to set it aside as an environmental, park of some kind. So the more wealth there is, the more they spend. Back to your question, though, on the mechanism. Now, this is a complicated story, but some of the best example comes from the common law and the story of Pittsburgh. Basically, the common law, for example, if you live on the side of a river, and all of a sudden the river's polluted and the fish are dead or whatever, the common law, which is the law that was in England and we had in America and still have to some extent, you could go to court and you find the person upstream who's polluting and you can stop him in a court of law, because the common law says the water leaving your property has to be as clean as the water entering your property. So you can track down who caused that pollution and you can go to court and stop it. So the common law had its own natural systems of stopping pollution. In Pittsburgh, the industry in the early 1900s was booming. There was incredible smoke all over the place from the steel mills and so forth. So a lady who's drying her clothes in her backyard that were covered with soot, she goes to court and says, this is unfair. This soot is making my life worse. It's hurting my health. It's hurting my property. And the court, she should have been able, with the common law, to stop the factories from polluting or to make them compensate her. So that was the common law. We had a switch in the U.S. based on utilitarian ideas, the greatest good for the greatest number, that progress depended on just rolling over the rights of some because we needed more factories, we needed more industry. So what the courts did is decide not to enforce the common law protections on pollution. And instead, the judge used the term the onward spirit of the age.
Wow.
The greatest good for the greatest number is to let the factory and the 10,000 workers keep going. And those farmers that their land is wrecked, they can just start another farm less expensively somewhere else. That's the Ducktown copper case, and that case of an arsenic from a copper plant.
Is that a Supreme Court case?
I don't know. I don't remember.
That's fascinating, though, because I'm already hearing jump out. I mean, for one person's side of the resolution, the idea of valuing common law versus an onward spirit of the age, or progressivism, right? And saying that the status quo, or they don't even have to get into the status quo, they should say that developing countries should value common law, and that will protect and safeguard in ways that policy people and individuals won't.
Right. I mean, the premise, the premise of the resolution sounds like the government's going to decide whether it should promote environmental protection or promote economic development. The government shouldn't do any of that. I mean, the political side of the government, the legal system itself, what is it that people want? How much environmental cleanliness do people want? How much economic development do they want? For example, here's an example. If you were to say, we want to open a big coal plant in India or in China. In fact, for the China resolution, that's a big deal. And you might say, gosh, it's awful to have these coal plants that are pumping out pollution into the air. But the leading cause of death in India, for example, is air pollution, but not from coal. It's from indoor air pollution, from the lack of electricity that would come from coal plants. It's from people burning dung and wood in their house for cooking. And it causes something like 1 million deaths for respiratory infection in children a year. So it's huge. But it's the lack of electricity. So you could say if you build coal plants, that pushes economic development at the expense of pollution that comes out of the coal plant. But that pollution actually is decreasing what's really killing people, which is the lack of electricity. So it's I don't know if that seems complicated.
That's a fascinating application. Yeah, I'm sure there are loads of examples like that, right? And that's probably, I mean, that's more like Freakonomics research than economics, right?
Yeah, no, this is a complicated thing because and another layer of complication. I just read a major article about reducing pollution in China, but they're counting CO2 emissions as a greenhouse gas, which it is, but as a pollutant. And so the question, I'm going to turn off my deal here. The question here is, sorry, where are you? Where'd you go?
I'm here.
So the question here is, I mean, even beyond the idea of protecting the environment, CO2, that students, I think, are going to have to look at the question of CO2, both the China topic and the LD topic. If you count that as pollution, that leads to a whole range of policies that slow economic growth in the name of preserving the environment. And yet, it's hard to find something better for the environment than CO2 because it's what trees and plants breathe. So you got to dig in a little bit to the debate over global warming to see the ups and downs of that. I think students can do that in a way that isn't too controversial.
Interesting. So I've got two questions for you then, based on what you've said so far. And one of them is there an accepted definition of developing country?
I think there are. Like China, for example, is a developing country. Now, it's also a very prosperous, wealthy country in those provinces that are developed, near Hong Kong and along the coast, but
Right.
it's generally considered a developing country. And I think that's the average income level. What you actually get a lot in this topic is developing countries and then the middle income trap. The argument that what's happened in Brazil, for example, they got started to develop and then they got trapped, they got stuck. So there's a real concern about...
Well, it's because they didn't win the World Cup.
Yeah, maybe that was it. But economists would argue that, it's regulatory issues. If you look at the Economic Freedom Index, in fact, one of the things I'll link to, if you look at the Economic Freedom Index, you find that when countries are economically more free, their pollution levels decline. So you can find a link between environmental benefits and economic freedom. And that's because it just takes money to clean things up. A factory that's not polluting, that has $1 million of pollution capture equipment, just costs more to operate. So you need prosperity to convince people to spend money in cleaning up the air and the water.
Interesting. Okay, so my next question is on the Acoustics Curve argument. How many countries do you think still exist at the less than 6,000 to 8,000 annual income? Do you think that, is this a good bright line for the topic? Because it seems like it almost answers the topic. Or do you think the intent and depth of the topic is that there are some countries on both sides of that line that are probably still considered developing, and that's where the heart of the debate is?
Good question. I don't have a clear answer to that. To some extent, all countries are developing. They're improving. They're going. They're moving from A to B.
Yeah.
But the topic refers to poor countries, and so it's talking about India, Pakistan, countries in the Middle East. Should they spend more resources pursuing environmental benefits, environmental protection, or should they pursue development? And I think it's problematic right from the start, because you've got government officials deciding what they're going to push and what they're going to stop, and that's a danger sign. So what we really care about is people. What is it that people? It's unfair for people to suffer under heavy pollution because some factory is polluting the water or polluting the air around them. That is flat unfair. So we want those pollution levels to go down. But it's also tragic and unfair for people to be stunningly, incredibly poor, which they are in much of China and much of India. So the affirmative, if the negative is pushing policies for protecting the environment, what are the costs of that? And for the affirmative, pushing economic development, the thing is you can do all sorts of stuff in the name of economic development that doesn't actually develop the economy. Many of these policies are counterproductive. Mm-hmm. And maybe that sounds too complicated for debaters for this topic, but it's an issue.
So one of the challenges that always happens in these value debates is sometimes debaters basically aren't forced to make a policy, and so they debate purely on theoretical terms. Do you think that there's enough literature and examples over the industrial age that debaters should be drawing solely on existing, documented things that happen in developing countries? Or do you think there's still a lot of room to make odd predictions about the future and not really have to prove out your side of the resolution? I don't know if you've ever judged one of these LD debates that I'm talking about. My guess is you have.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things to talk about. Ultimately we care about human life and human freedom, right? Those are sort of the core issues. And like the latest encyclical from the Pope about environmental issues is all over the news, where he's claiming that we've over-industrialized, we've got to change to protect the environment and protect the poor. That seems to me, there's many articles about that. But there's a debate over how you get there, right? There's a debate, do you need more regulation to stop pollution? Well, that sounds like a good idea, except the common law system used the courts to stop pollution. When someone was harmed, they would sue in court. And which is the best way? The EPA, wants to regulate mud puddles, according to according to critics. So giving the federal government more power under the Clean Water Act, for example, does that protect the environment? Or maybe that slowed protection. In fact, if you look at the story of the passage of the Clean Water Act, there's 3 or 4 weeks of testimony in Congress, and you think, well, who is testifying in favor of the Clean Water Act? Environmental groups? Well, no, it turns out all the organizations testifying were industry groups, chemical companies, business groups. They wanted the Clean Water Act as a way to protect them from lawsuits that they were afraid of. And so you can look into that story. That complicates things. We want cleaner environment, but what's the best way to get it? How do you actually get it? And economists argue that its prosperity is a big part of that. Wealthy people can make more choices, can spend more money cleaning the water, spend more money cleaning the air.
Yeah, and I think very challenging part about this topic is empathy too, because when you're talking about developing countries, it's really easy to point fingers from a rich country, and being able to look back into our own history, which has its negatives and its positives, but approach the topic of a developing country from the mindset of someone in a developing country. I think that's going to be one of the hardest things about taking a human perspective to this topic.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. In India, for example, we had an India topic many years ago. In India, the new conservative or pro-market government, which is also a nationalist government, has banned a number of U.S. environmental organizations for fighting against coal plants and for wind power and solar power. Now you think, well, that's weird. Well,
that's probably GE lobbying, because GE wants that contract to install those plants, right?
So it could sound, from the corporate side, it could sound that way. But of course, the wind power and solar power, those are huge corporations as well in India, China, and the U.S. But the argument that's made is that environmental groups want to block the development of energy to the developing world, or they want it to be solar energy. They don't want to have coal power plants because they're afraid of global warming. So we want to separate between air pollution, particulate matter that can hurt people's health out of factories, from CO2 emissions.
Right.
If you label CO2 emissions a pollution and mix it all together with other pollutions, you're making a sort of a political decision. So again, students may not want to be dragged into the global warming debate, but there are ways, I think, to do that in a responsible way, citing leading scientists and so forth. I'll be posting more about this. But we don't want poor people in developing countries to be stuck with particulate matter and air pollution that's killing them. But again, the central thing killing them is air pollution from indoor air pollution. Also, Hans Rosling, the Danish or the Swedish statistician, has a great video. If you look for a washing machine and Hans Rosling, he basically says the majority of women in the world don't have access to a washing machine. They're washing clothes by hand. It's women doing this, not men, because they don't have access to electricity. They might have enough solar power for a light bulb. But, we can't, many environmentalists say, look, the Earth can't stand to have 8 billion people with access to electricity. And that's sort of easy for us to say as we drive around and we Skype and we use all the electricity here to say that people in India, and China can't have electricity. But that's deeply, deeply unfair, troubling, unjust.
Well, thank you for enlightening us as to, I think, the human implications of this topic, as well as some of the economic ones. Much appreciated. Everyone, Greg Rehmke, economicthinking.org. Watch his blog and come to our camps because he'll be teaching there. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, thank you.